So next we're moving on to enforcement. And if you haven't realized yet, we've gone down a path today of looking at security, intelligence, enforcement, and how they interact with each other. We've also looked at the advertising research and intelligence there as well, and looking through that life cycle. So the last panel today, that we're going to do today is on enforcement before we then talk to Interpol. And as I mentioned in my opening, enforcement in various territories has become tougher to achieve. And similarly, where we are achieving enforcement goals, they do have a global impact. There's very little cases that we see anymore where piracy is contained to one jurisdiction. And so it's about how we can enforce in a world that is connected digitally, yet physically disconnected at the moment. So today I'd like to welcome three speakers. We have Mark Mulready, Vice President of Cyber Services at Irdeto. He's also co-chair of CAP's sister organisation in Europe, who has been mentioned already today, ARPA. Stefan, Sergot, Head of Legal Enforcement at the Premier League, and Cédric Hardouin, Executive Vice President, Research and Development, Viaccess-Orca. So welcome, all three of you. It's really good for you to join us today.
Thanks, Aaron.
Cédric, if I could start with you, and the reason I want to start with you is I'd like you to introduce Viaccess, if you could please. You're probably one of the organisations who are joining us today, which people don't necessarily know a lot about in Asia Pacific. So if you could just spend a minute just sharing a little bit about Viaccess with us.
Yeah, okay. So Viaccess is a French company having Orange Group as a shareholder, and we have many customers all over the world, from Mexico to Mongolia, in Europe, in Africa. So everywhere, and we provide a very large portfolio of products and solutions in the TV domain. A few years ago, we added anti-piracy services in this portfolio to complement our security solution.
Great, thank you. And you do a lot of work on investigations in websites and apps, and at a broad level, nearly all cases have that level of multi-jurisdictional approach, you know, servers in one country, operators in another. How does that impact your investigative process, first of all?
So to answer your question, no real impact for those investigations. Maybe I can describe what happens with a very concrete case. So we have just signed with a new customers, and the press release will be issued in the coming days. So I will not name it, otherwise my communication team will not be happy. But they have some very valuable content, and they are highly active in France because they have live premium content. So we have been starting the collaboration for 6 months, and I will explain why they have started to do that. So when we run anti-piracy services, what has been said just before in the previous panel is we need to collect data. So data is really the key of this is a pillar of everything. So we collect data to many different data, some evidence for the court cases, and some technical data. And then we build a map of the illegal streaming services, and those illegal streaming services are provided by are carried by different infrastructure service providers. And those infrastructure service providers are spread over several countries. So what we start to do is to send some take-down notice to those ESP. Some of them are very reactive and concerned by the topic. Some of them are not at all. So we first work with the one who are collaborative, let's say, and we try to shut down the server during the live event. Okay, why? Because then it damages the experience of the end user. So that's what we try to do every time. So we try to damage the experience of the end user. And then the resellers will move to another infrastructure service provider, which are not responsive to our request. So we play cat and mouse in a kind of a guerrilla mode. And then why is this new customer started to work with us 6 months ago? Because we have been doing with them this takedown notice to the ESP, but the big change in France is that the French Parliament has recently adopted a new law that will allow us to fight much more efficiently live event piracy by enabling a dynamic IP ban. So when I say dynamic, it means that as soon as the notification is done, in the coming 30 minutes, the ban of the IP will have to be done. So that's the last option, the good option to really stop piracy in a country. And I mean, Stefan will explain this probably later, but we will mimic in France the process which has already been put in place in UK, in Portugal, and some other countries.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic development in France, and a nice evolution from the old Hadopi style. Mark, if I can turn to you, I mean, with your ARPA hat on, you're supporting law enforcement in a not too dissimilar way from CAP. However, I'm going to jealously say that you have the advantage of having a pan-European policing agency with Europol there. Can you give some some of an idea of how beneficial that is to achieving enforcement outcomes when you're dealing with a pan-European issue?
Sure. I mean, certainly it is an advantage to have Europol as a partner to ARPA, and it's a relationship that we kind of value very highly and continue to nurture. Look, it's a fact that nearly all large-scale piracy investigations that our members are involved in, they're cross-border in nature these days. You have bank accounts, you have hosting companies, registries, business entities, and targets operating in different jurisdictions. And Europol has played a really important role, a centralized coordination role in several high-profile cases in recent years. By first being like a focal point, liaising with the relevant member states to get buy-in for the cases initially, so that they will undertake their own further investigations. And then secondly, the other important role they play is exchanging of intelligence between the various territories. And finally, they help kind of bring all these complex cases to successful resolution by coordinating and supporting operations, involving search warrant executions and detailed evidence gathering in the various territories. From the ARPA side, we because we value this quite highly, this extension of reach for our members, we provide training to investigators from Europol member states to help improve the level of knowledge and increase capacity. We provide resources on the ground for investigations if it's needed. And we partner with them in specific initiatives targeting online infringement like Operation iOS, and also with other community awareness initiatives. We're a long-time sponsor of the Europol IP Crime Conference, where we often present case studies jointly with law enforcement on successful actions, and that helps build awareness with other police about how they can tackle the problem of cross-border piracy, because quite often part of the challenge for our members is law enforcement may not have the knowledge or the capabilities necessarily to do this independently. So when you can show them how it's done, it's very valuable. And we also present awards on an annual basis to law enforcement, government and regulators who are supporting us in the fight against piracy. But I think also, Aaron, it's important to mention it's not obviously just Europol. There's a number of other EU agencies that provide tremendous support to ARPA and our members, including Eurojust, who are EU's hub for judicial cooperation, who have also been very active in recent years coordinating several cross-border streaming piracy investigations. Also the EU IPO and the Observatory. They provided tremendous support in terms of research, and they're actually a major driver in getting IP crime back on the MPAC priorities for the period 2022 to 2025. And that's important because that means that the EU member states have a mandate and resourcing to focus on IP crime during that period. So yeah, these are very important relationships for us. And then on top of that, Interpol has established recently a digital piracy unit, and they've recently launched their Stop Online Piracy project, ISOP, which is a multi-year project funded by the Korean government to tackle piracy, particularly IPTV piracy. And so AAPA is also partnering with Interpol on that particular initiative, and we see that as very valuable and important to extend the enforcement beyond Europe, to the globe.
Yeah, fantastic, Mark. And Nick Court from Interpol is actually joining us following this presentation, so I'll let him share his wealth of knowledge on that one. But you're right. I mean, it really is important that we spread from Europe globally. I just want to ask one more question of you before I turn to Stefan. You made a point on Eurojust and EU IPO also being critical partners. What would be the result if they weren't as engaged on these issues? Do you think you would have the success you already do?
No, I don't, quite frankly, because, those agencies, as I said, they have a kind of crucial role in helping the EU to understand the extent of the problem. So the research is very important, and the work that the observatory does there. And yeah, heads up, there will be more coming on that from APA down the track. Without having IP crime as a priority on the impact, as an impact priority, the reality is there just wouldn't be such a focus on the problem. So those agencies are, in my mind, equally as important as Europol in driving the agenda.
Great, thank you. And that's really interesting information, just sort of to get a gauge of what perhaps is lacking in Asia to achieve similar kind of results. Stefan, if I can turn to you, and thanks for joining us and waiting so patiently there. Mark and Cédric have talked a little bit about the impact of the Europe-wide kind of work that's going on. Let's talk about practical case spanning multiple jurisdictions, and let's talk about Mobdro, for example, where we know the main actor was Spanish, but actions required in different territories. As a rights owner, who are you dealing with? Are you dealing with one country who then coordinates, or are you liaising across multiple jurisdictions and bodies, or are you liaising with different vendors? I mean, how to work from that multi-jurisdictional approach?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And I think, as has already been sort of articulated in the panel, there's very few cases these days that don't have some form of cross-border element to them. And obviously that does present a challenge, and how we go about trying to address that challenge and work with law enforcement will partly depend on what the circumstances of that case are. So with Mobdro, that was one that we've been investigating for a very long time. It became a key priority for us. We were seeing it, it was probably the most infamous piracy brand in the world. We were seeing it in the UK, we were seeing it in Europe, the US, we were seeing it through our enforcement work against ISD sellers in Southeast Asia. And so, we've done a lot of work technically and also through covert surveillance on the ground that led us to be very confident that it was an individual primarily in Spain that was operating it. And actually, around the same time, ACE had independently come to a very similar conclusion. So then it came about identifying the right law enforcement unit within the Spanish police to take the case forward and ultimately dismantle it. We were very aware that there were likely to be individuals and infrastructure being used outside of Spain, but it was actually the Spanish police that broadened that investigation and brought in the law enforcement bodies from other jurisdictions, and very successfully in the end, because the service was taken down. There are other cases, though, where from the outset, it's very clear that it's going to require some form of coordinated approach across multiple different countries. In 2019, we were involved in Operation Panelists, which was a major operation into a pirate IPTV service that spanned across Europe. And in that one, we knew that there were prime individuals in Spain, but we also knew that they were in Scandinavia and elsewhere in Europe. And so with that situation, we still had to go through a national police force, and we did that through the Spanish police again, but that was with the knowledge that it would likely be referred on to the likes of Europol for coordinated action from the start. And that was a really successful operation. I think they raided 12 locations in the end simultaneously, and freezed something like 30 bank accounts across Europe as part of it. And so that can also work, but is obviously more difficult and quite time consuming. And then you've got a whole nother category of case, which is where you start in one country, and then over the course of the investigation, you end up in a completely different country. So, the Expat TV service, for example, was a Pan-Asian piracy network that had dedicated services for individuals in different countries across Asia. And we'd originally thought it was being operated from Hong Kong, but then as our investigation developed, it became clear that actually the headquarters were in Thailand. So we had to shift our focus and ended up working with the Thai police to take that service down. And so we ended up having a case that started in Hong Kong, but it was actually the Thai courts that dished out suspended prison sentences and heavy fines to the individuals involved. So you've also got to be flexible and agile enough to adapt, because these investigations are complex and often fluid and require you to react. And so there are obviously a few different practical examples of how we've dealt with it in the past. But I think an important point is, even where there are lots of different countries involved, there may be a specific country that if you target, it may be possible to still impact and take down that service without necessarily needing coordinated action across many different countries. Sometimes it does require that. But one thing that is always required, we think is doing as much of the heavy lifting as we can. I think it's been alluded to already on the previous panel and by Mark that it's really important that we do as much as we can ourselves to try and identify the individuals behind the services, to work out what the technical infrastructure involved is as well, so that when we go to law enforcement, we're not just reporting a service and asking them to take it down. We're actually going to them with a packaged up case that hopefully makes their lives easier and allows us the best possible chance of a successful resolution.
Yeah, look, thanks, Stefan. And you've actually touched on a couple of really interesting points that I wanted to raise with Cédric next. And those are basically, oftentimes intellectual property cases are down the priority list for enforcement bodies. And so packaging up those cases is really important. But is there also an element of focusing on territories that have more capacity or more willingness to take on cases? That is, are we jurisdiction shopping a little bit to make these cases work?
I would say yes and no. Yes, because anyway, when we start doing this, it allows to demonstrate to all. I mean, when I say all, see all over the world that the changes in the law. So what has been done in France very recently, for instance, can lead to results for fighting piracy. So when we do that, even if we work only in France, okay, so it will be done next year, we are able to demonstrate that there are some results, and that's very important to demonstrate this to the other countries, so that we can start the lobbying in those countries to explain that this kind of countermeasure is mandatory if we want to fight piracy. And when I say yes and no, it's no also because the content owner wants to act where his content, his premium content, his live content has the more value. And that's the issue that we sometimes have. That if I go back to this example of France, even if we can do some things in UK, for instance, at the end, the content owner, the real value of his content is in France. So he wants to act in France and to have some action in France.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, as well as jurisdiction shopping, we're also trying to make sure that we're attacking the jurisdiction where the person is, or where the content is likely to be viewed the most, which obviously adds to that challenge. Mark, we can take down these things. We can take down these networks and work with Europol and Eurojust and local enforcement bodies in any country. But is the speed of enforcement really fast enough to make any meaningful difference? Or are we looking at it wrong? And what is the outcome of enforcement really trying to get to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've been on the other side of the fence as a law enforcement officer myself, Aaron, so I understand that resources are skinny. There is competing priorities, and I think our industry certainly understands that, and we certainly don't expect law enforcement to solve every challenge for us. But look, the reality is with these, with piracy, it morphs and changes very, very quickly, and they can come and go within a matter of months. So the speed of enforcement, I think, needs to improve. I think in terms of the exchange of intelligence between law enforcement agencies, the mutual assistance program can be quite cumbersome, I think. But yeah, the reality is, if we want to address these pirate networks, it would be great from our perspective if law enforcement had a swifter, had a faster ability to quickly exchange information. However, having said that, we do see an important kind of mutual benefit in partnering with them on the larger cases in particular, which are likely to make a meaningful and measurable difference based on the size and the popularity of the pirate service or the app or whatever it is, and where law enforcement can seize proceeds of crime. This is why Europol and national law enforcement agencies are becoming, I think, increasingly interested in these types of matters, because there are substantial assets that are derived from the proceeds of crime. So quite often, we will see that they will seize properties, bank accounts, cash, Bitcoin wallets, luxury motor vehicles. So cases like Belinus and Mobdro that Stefan referred to, those bigger types of cases, there's real value in those because they provide an important kind of message of deterrence for other would-be pirates. But even more importantly, they provide an opportunity to warn the public about the risks of using pirated services and the criminal nature of what they're embarking upon.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. And I think that deterrent effect is really something that we have to grapple our head around, rather than it being being the only solution to it. And on that point, Stefan, enforcement can take various forms, and working with the police is one way of doing it, but it can be notoriously slow. But there are technical outcomes which can be just as effective. So site blocking, which has been referred to earlier, and that dynamic site blocking that you're doing, which is done on that territorial level. But EPL have also taken action with seizing some domains as well. And it's also been referred to that other cases such as AVIA-CBN have recently been doing this in the US to seize domains affecting Philippine sites. Can you talk us through that process and the speed that you can make that you can make an impact contrasted with that traditional law enforcement process that we've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, I think it's all about having a mix of measures to try and tackle the problem. So, we're always trying to have a range of short, medium, and long-term actions on foot, and there absolutely is a place for some of the big criminal cases that we've been talking about so far in this panel. We don't think there's any better deterrent than someone going to prison for operating a pirate service, and so we'll continue to push those big cases and those big networks through the criminal courts if we can, and try and go for the biggest sentences that we can. But obviously the other side of that coin is that it does take, as you said, Aaron, does take quite a long time. You have to be patient, and that's particularly the case when it's novel. We've had the first prosecution of an ISD seller that we brought in the UK back in 2006. That took years to resolve. Similarly in Singapore, the Synex case, which I'm sure a number of AVIA members will be aware of, but it was the first prosecution of a ISD seller in Singapore that was brought by us alongside a couple of other AVIA members. That even after law enforcement's involvement had finished was more than 2 years to make it through the court. So we do always try and supplement it with other actions. But I must say they are helped, those other actions, by some of the deterrent big cases that we've been talking about. Since the Synex case, we've been running an effective letter campaign to try and make sure that the sales of ISDs giving access to Premier League content anyway are remaining low, and we also have been seizing domains through knock and talk actions, which we think is a really effective way of dealing with pirates that aren't necessarily as sophisticated or making as much money from piracy as, say, a Mobdro was doing. And so in those circumstances, to give you an example, we were grappling with a website called StreamCR7, which was a popular sports streaming website. It was getting visits from all around the world, including Southeast Asia, and we ran an investigation that identified the operator in Pakistan. And as part of that investigation, we ran on-the-ground surveillance to try and, first of all, establish his address, but also to get a sense of his lifestyle and a sense of how much money he may have been making from the service. And once we were comfortable that he wasn't someone that was operating at the same level as say, a Mobdro or Benelux or expat TV, we decided that it's a challenging jurisdiction, so let's move quickly, and so we essentially turned up at his front door, served him with legal letter, and just the prospect of some of the enforcement action that we've already been talking about in this panel was enough to spook him into taking the sites offline, to giving control of the domains to us, and also to giving us information on the supply chain higher up that's now triggered some onward investigations for us. So it can be really effective, and obviously if you're in control directly of that action, it can be quicker. So we're talking, a few months rather than several years for an action like that. But it won't always be the most proportionate or effective way of dealing with an issue. I think it's really important to identify the right type of case for that sort of action. And that generally goes for anti-piracy strategies more generally, not just legal actions. Legal actions are, of course, a really important part of an anti-piracy strategy, but they have to, of course, be supplemented with, as you said, Aaron, blocking, with technical measures, with disruption, with education, with lobbying, and so on, really. So it's one piece of a much larger strategy.
Thanks, Stefan. And look, thank you all. We are out of time. And thanks for spending the time talking about the challenges in working across multiple jurisdictions and what can be done with the limitations that are provided within that context. So thank you, Cédric, Mark, and Stefan, for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to working with you all soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.